For decades, we have repeated almost without thinking that we live in a capitalist system, although we rarely stop to specify exactly what that word means. The problem is not only theoretical. In the mid-20th century, economists were already pointing out that a growing part of economic activity was not organized in open markets, but within large organizations that decided prices, production, and resource allocation internally. As Yanis Varoufakis has pointed out, the term capitalism continued to be used even when the practices that had defined it began to fade. This continuity of language has helped conceal a profound change in the actual way of organizing the economy. In its classical form, capitalism was organized around the market. The idea was simple. Different companies competed with each other to sell products and services to people who could compare and choose. Prices emerged from this competition. Inefficient companies fell behind, while those that innovated and offered better products thrived. The market functioned as an open space, where buyers and sellers met without either having absolute control over the exchange. Although this image always simplified a more complex reality, it described quite well how the economy operated during the 19th century and much of the 20th, from small workshops vying for contracts to merchants working with multiple suppliers. But it only takes entering a large digital platform today to realize that we are no longer in that type of market. We do not access a common space where different offers are presented on equal terms. We enter an environment completely controlled by a single entity, which not only decides which products appear, but also the very space in which they are shown and the invisible rules that govern everything we see. The algorithm determines what is presented to us and what remains hidden, and each user receives a different experience, isolated from others. There is no shared public square, no place where consumers can meet, compare experiences, or act collectively. This change did not happen overnight, nor was it the result of a deliberate conspiracy. It occurred through successive transformations that gradually altered the structure of capitalism until it became something qualitatively different. To understand how we got here, it is necessary to go back to a key moment when industrial capitalism began to show its first cracks and competition ceased to be the true driving force of the system. The US economy during World War II offers a revealing preview of what would come afterward. The state did not just coordinate production, it centrally planned it. Public agencies allocated raw materials, set priorities, and established prices to avoid inflation. Large companies produced exactly what the government ordered, at the price it set, with the certainty that all production would be purchased through guaranteed contracts. Car manufacturers stopped producing civilian vehicles to make tanks and bombers according to state specifications. The result was an extraordinary productive expansion, with a massive increase in production and surprisingly controlled inflation. What was truly decisive was what happened after the war ended. This structure was not dismantled, it simply adapted to peacetime. A form of organization emerged that economist John Kenneth Galbraith described as a fusion between large corporations and the state, sustained by a constant flow of people between both spheres. Business executives moved into public positions, civil servants returned to the private sector, and technical experts moved interchangeably between ministries and boards of directors. The goal shifted from competing in open markets to maximize profits to ensuring the continuous growth of large conglomerates through planning and coordination. This system posed an evident problem. Without the war, there was no longer an unlimited demand guaranteed by the state. The factories that had produced armaments now needed to sell consumer goods. However, the productive capacity was so large that the domestic market was insufficient. Buyers had to be found abroad while simultaneously creating domestic demand capable of absorbing that production. It was not enough to manufacture products. It was also necessary to manufacture the desire to consume them. Here, a cultural transformation of enormous scope occurred. Advertising already existed, but in the decades following the war, it took on a completely new function. It stopped being limited to informing about products and began shaping desires, aspirations, and needs. Large corporations discovered that they could directly influence what the population considered valuable, necessary, or desirable. People's attention became a central economic resource, as important as the workforce. Commercial television was the perfect instrument for this new model. Programs were offered for free because the real product was not the content, but the attention of the viewers, sold to advertisers. This logic transformed the relationship between production and consumption. Commercial success ceased to depend mainly on the utility or quality of goods and came to be determined by the effectiveness of advertising strategies. In offices far from the factories, decisions were made not only about prices and presentations, but also about the emotions and lifestyles associated with each product. This form of economic organization contained a remarkable historical paradox. While the United States denounced the centralized planning of the Soviet Union as a threat to freedom, it implemented surprisingly similar planning mechanisms within its own territory. The difference was not in the logic, but in the form. US planning maintained private property and operated through coordination between large corporations and the state, rather than direct state control. Even so, competition ceased to be the fundamental organizing principle. For a time, the system worked remarkably well. The period known as the Golden Age of Capitalism, from the end of the war to the early 1970s, was characterized by sustained growth, low unemployment, and a significant reduction in inequality. But this balance depended on very specific conditions that could not be maintained indefinitely. The post-war equilibrium rested on a very precise international architecture. In 1944, the Bretton Woods agreements had created a monetary system based on fixed exchange rates, where the main currencies were linked to the dollar, and the dollar, in turn, had a direct conversion to gold. This design allowed Europe and Japan to be rebuilt after the war, injecting dollars into their economies with the expectation that this money would return to the United States in the form of purchases of machinery, technology, and industrial goods. For the system to work, the United States had to export more than it imported on a constant basis. For several years, this condition was met. However, three processes began to erode it. The first was the Vietnam War, which forced the US to spend enormous sums abroad without generating equivalent exports. The second was the expansion of social spending in the US, which increased domestic consumption and, with it, imports. The third was the industrial success of Germany and Japan, whose economies, rebuilt with modern technology, reached levels of efficiency and quality superior in key sectors, gradually reversing the US trade balance. When trade deficits became chronic, the system ceased to be viable. Financial markets anticipated that the dollar could no longer maintain its value against gold and began exchanging dollars for US reserves. The gold in Fort Knox began to disappear at an alarming rate. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon unilaterally canceled the convertibility of the dollar into gold. With that decision, the system of fixed exchange rates came to an end, dismantling the central pillar of the post-war international economy. What followed was not a return to 19th century competitive capitalism. Something completely different emerged. Paradoxically, US deficits stopped weakening the dollar and began to strengthen its hegemony. The US started to import massive amounts of manufactured goods, but the profits from those exports did not stay in the producing countries. They returned to Wall Street in the form of financial investments. A recycling circuit of capital was created that placed the US financial system at the center of the global economy. This new order required profound changes within the United States itself. To maintain the profitability of capital against more efficient foreign competitors, it became necessary to reduce labor costs. Union power was systematically weakened, and real wages stopped growing. The clearest symbolic gesture occurred in 1981 when President Ronald Reagan fired thousands of striking air traffic controllers and banned them from returning to work for the government. The message was unequivocal. The government would no longer protect workers' ability to negotiate collectively. Since then, real wages have remained virtually stagnant. At the same time, restrictions imposed on banks after the Great Depression were dismantled. The separation between commercial banking and investment banking gradually dissolved until it completely disappeared by the end of the 20th century. The big banks regained the ability to speculate using deposits from ordinary citizens and, increasingly, money created through loans that existed only as accounting records. This deregulation did not reduce government intervention. Instead, it reorganized it for the benefit of the financial sector. Computing played a decisive role, though not in the way it is commonly imagined. It did not immediately transform industrial productivity, but revolutionized finance. It allowed the creation of financial products of extreme complexity, structured through mathematical models that concealed the real risks. Securitized debt, Default insurance and synthetic derivatives multiplied, redistributing risks without eliminating them. Opacity became an advantage, not a problem. The volume of these financial bets grew to colossal dimensions. By the early 21st century, the total value of derivatives far exceeded global income. This was not real wealth, but a gigantic web of interconnected contractual commitments, sustained by the belief that no one would fail at the same time. It was a stable system only as long as nothing went wrong. When that balance broke in 2008, the collapse was almost instantaneous. Mortgages granted to families without the ability to pay had been transformed into supposedly safe products and sold worldwide. When defaults began, the global financial system came to a halt. It was not just the bankruptcy of a few banks at stake, but the basic functioning of the payment system on which every modern economy depends. Governments intervened to prevent total collapse. Banks were bailed out with public money, and central banks created massive amounts of money to stabilize the system. Losses were socialized, while the profits accumulated in previous years remained in private hands. However, this bailout did not restore the previous order. The created money did not return to fuel the productive economy. It remained trapped in the financial system, inflating asset prices and setting the stage for new crises. From this process, neither a renewed capitalism nor a more efficient version of the market emerged. Something different emerged. The large tech platforms, which had until then grown on the margins of the system, began to occupy central positions, but they did not operate as traditional capitalist companies. They did not primarily compete in open markets. They built closed infrastructures that replaced the markets themselves. Buying on a dominant platform is not equivalent to freely choosing from offers visible to all. It means moving within an algorithmically controlled environment where each option has been filtered and ordered according to opaque criteria. Sellers pay to access that space and accept rules that can change at any moment. Competition exists only in appearance, conditioned by decisions that do not follow the logic of the market, but rather the control of the infrastructure. This is not simply a monopoly. In a monopoly, there is still a common space where participants can compare and coordinate. In a dominant digital platform, each user lives in an isolated environment. There is no shared reference or real possibility of collective action. The market as a public space disappears and is replaced by a private architecture that intermediates all relationships. The relationship between the platform and those who use it is no longer primarily contractual. It is structural. Users do not depend on it because they have freely chosen to do so, but because alternatives have ceased to exist. Freedom remains on a formal level, but dependence is imposed in practice. For 2 centuries, economic freedom was understood as market freedom, the ability to choose, compare, and change. This freedom implied the existence of common markets and visible rules. When these markets are replaced by mandatory private infrastructures, freedom is emptied of meaning without disappearing from the discourse. We are not witnessing a radicalization of capitalism, but rather its transformation into something different. The system did not collapse or get overthrown. It slowly metamorphosed, retaining words and appearances while its substance changed. We continue to call it capitalism, but it no longer functions as such. And as long as we fail to understand this change, we will continue trying to explain the present with concepts that belong to a world that no longer exists. The birth of cloud capital. To understand what has emerged after this transformation, it is not enough to simply point out that large tech corporations are powerful or that digital platforms today occupy a central place in the economy. That is visible to anyone. What truly matters is understanding what kind of capital they represent, how their power works, and why their emergence marks a historical break comparable to the one that separated feudalism from capitalism. This is not just another evolution within the same system, but a change in the deep logic that organizes production, dependence, and social control. In its classical form, capital was composed of material means of production, tools, machines, factories, physical infrastructures that increased the productivity of human labor. Ownership of these means granted power because those who did not own them had no realistic alternative to survive outside the labor market. Workers, lacking access to these resources, were forced to sell their labor in exchange for a wage. This structural asymmetry defined the social relations of industrial capitalism. However, the power of capital never truly resided in the technical properties of machines or tools, but in certain social conditions. This became clear in a seemingly minor episode in the 19th century. Thomas Peel, a British businessman, emigrated to Western Australia bringing along hired workers, modern tools, seeds, and abundant financial capital. He assumed that by owning the means of production he would have authority over his employees. But the opposite happened. The workers abandoned him as soon as they discovered they could access available land and work for themselves. Peel was left with excellent tools and money, but without anyone to work for him. His capital, identical to the one he had in England, had lost its power to command. This episode reveals something fundamental. Capital does not dominate because machines have a magical quality, but because there are social conditions that force those who do not own means of production to work for those who do. In England, those conditions were created through the enclosures of the 17th and 18th centuries, which privatized communal lands and expelled peasants, leaving them with no alternatives. In Western Australia, where land was abundant, that dependence did not exist. The capital was the same, but the social context was different, and with it, its power disappeared. The transition from feudalism to capitalism relied precisely on this process. Power shifted from landowners to capital owners, but only after the violent destruction of the commons, that is, the shared resources that allowed people to survive without submitting to the labor market. Without the enclosures, capitalism would not have existed, because workers would have retained alternatives outside the wage relationship. A profoundly similar process has occurred with the rise of cloud capital. Before this new type of capital could acquire the extraordinary power it holds today, it was necessary to destroy another common, the original internet. And just as the enclosures of land were not a natural or inevitable process, but the result of specific political decisions, the privatization of the digital space was also a deliberate institutional choice, not an inevitable technical consequence. The internet was born as a public project. It was initially developed as a communication network funded by the state, designed for military and scientific purposes, and managed through universities and research centers. Its organizational principles combined centralized planning of objectives with decentralized execution, international academic cooperation, and above all, the absence of commercial goals. The basic protocols that allowed communication between computers were created as open, free, and accessible tools for anyone who wanted to use them. During that period, the internet truly functioned as a digital commons. It was a shared resource, collectively built by thousands of researchers, programmers, and users, with no exclusive owners or access barriers. No one owned the fundamental protocols, just as no one owns mathematical language or the air we breathe. The use of that resource by one person did not prevent its use by others, but this digital commons could only exist under certain political and ideological conditions. When the post-war order began to dismantle, when the economic system shifted orientation and the logic of privatization became the dominant principle, the internet was exposed to forces that no longer saw it as a shared space, but as an extraordinary opportunity for private accumulation. The decisive transformation was not technological, but political. The state made decisions that facilitated the private appropriation of the digital space. The most important of these was the refusal to provide citizens with a public and verifiable digital identity. While infrastructures like the global positioning system were opened up for civilian use free of charge, no equivalent was created for online identity. This omission was not inevitable or accidental. It was a decision that opened the door for private actors to fill that void. As a result, our digital identity became fragmented and privatized. Our financial data belongs to banks. Our purchase history belongs to commercial platforms. Our social relationships belong to private networks. Our location belongs to tech companies. Our cultural preferences belong to streaming services. None of these pieces really belong to us as individuals. This has a direct consequence. In order to exist and act in the digital space, we must give parts of our identity to private corporations, accepting terms that we do not negotiate and that can be changed at any time. We cannot prove who we are online without going through private intermediaries. This structural dependence is the foundation upon which cloud capital's power is built. A clear example of this situation is the everyday use of identification systems like Google account or Apple ID. Through a single private account, Millions of people access their email, store files, check calendars, use maps, install apps, and perform basic tasks to work and socialize. That identity does not only serve to confirm who the user is, but it also gathers information accumulated over the years: searches made, places visited, contacts, purchases, and usage habits. Losing access to that account, due to an automatic lock, a system failure, or a change in terms, means being locked out of many essential functions in the digital environment without any public alternative to recover or transfer that identity to another system. On this foundation of structural dependence, the core of the new capital was built. Large tech corporations developed systems capable of processing vast amounts of information about human behavior. It was not just about recording data, but constantly learning from it. These systems began to identify patterns, anticipate decisions, and adjust their responses in real time. They were not just sophisticated management tools or advanced versions of traditional advertising. They represented a qualitative leap in the way power could be exercised over human behavior. For a long time, algorithms were little more than rigid instructions that performed predefined tasks. Then they gained some flexibility, able to choose between pre-programmed options based on different conditions. The decisive break came when they began to evaluate themselves, learn from their own results, and modify themselves based on rewards and penalties. These systems no longer just executed human orders, they autonomously adjusted their strategies, processing volumes of information that were impossible for any individual or traditional institution to handle. Although they do not think or understand, these algorithms produce effects that, from the outside, resemble intentional action. They pursue goals, test paths, discard strategies, and optimize results. And most importantly, these results include the ability to systematically influence the behavior of millions of people at the same time. Not through explicit orders, but through the silent configuration of the environment in which decisions are made. The mechanism works as a continuous feedback loop. The system selects which content to show, which options to highlight, and which stimuli to present, aiming to capture attention and provoke responses. Each reaction, a click, a purchase, a longer pause, an interaction, feeds new data. With this data, the system learns what works best for each individual and adjusts its behavior. But at the same time, this process also transforms us. We become accustomed to certain rhythms, specific types of information, and expectations that the system itself has helped to create. This process is radically different from traditional advertising. In the past, messages were broadcasted in bulk from the outside, attempting to impose desires through repetition and visible persuasion. It was possible to recognize the influence and, at least in part, resist it. In contrast, current systems do not impose from the outside. They act from within, adapting to each person and presenting themselves as help, recommendation, or personal discovery. The influence is experienced as a free choice. When a platform recommends a song that perfectly fits our tastes, when it suggests a product we genuinely needed, or guides us through a more efficient route, the experience feels positive and genuine. The service works. But at the same time, we are being trained to trust that system, to delegate decisions, and to accept its judgment as superior to our own. Gradually, autonomous exploration becomes unnecessary and even uncomfortable. Over time, we not only stop deciding for ourselves in certain areas, but we also stop wanting to do so. Why search, compare, or doubt if the system has already selected what aligns with our preferences? The problem is that these preferences are not independent. They have been shaped by the same process that now satisfies them. The circle closes. We train the system with our data, and the system trains us to respond better to its stimuli, both converging toward patterns that maximize the goals of those who control the infrastructure. This power of behavioral modification is the heart of cloud capital, but its most decisive feature is the way it reproduces itself. Industrial capital expanded through wage labor. Workers produced goods that were sold in markets, and profits were reinvested in more production. This cycle required wages, contracts, and independent buyers who decided whether or not to purchase the produced goods. The cloud capital works in a completely different way. It does not require salaried work in the classical sense, nor competitive markets to reproduce itself. It expands through our unpaid labor as users. Every post, every shared image, every written review, every scroll, every daily interaction generates data that increases its value. There is no salary, no contract, and no recognition that any work is being done. Tech companies employ skilled workers who receive salaries, but they represent a minimal fraction of the total work that sustains the system. The majority of the value is not produced by employees, but by billions of people who participate for free, believing they are simply using a service. This asymmetry is not a mere accounting detail. It marks a historic break in the way of accumulation. We are facing a transformation comparable to the birth of capitalism. If that system was defined by separating producers from the means of production and forcing them to sell their labor, the current system reintegrates production and daily life, but under deeply unequal conditions. We continuously produce value, but we do not control the means by which we do so, nor do we receive any compensation. Our daily activity directly becomes raw economic material. In this new order, we are at the same time both producers and products. We generate data, content, and interactions that constitute cloud capital, and at the same time, we are the behaviors that this capital sells, shapes, and optimizes for third parties. The boundary between working and living dissolves. There is no longer a clearly separated space where production ends and private life begins. Furthermore, the relationship that binds us to the owners of these infrastructures is not contractual. There is no labor agreement that can be renegotiated. There is a structural dependence on private systems that have become indispensable for basic functions. To communicate, inform ourselves, shop, work, or participate culturally, we need to go through platforms that we do not control and whose rules we did not decide. These functions could be organized through open and common tools, as happened in the early years of the internet. But digital enclosures have deliberately privatized them, not because there are no technical alternatives, but because political and economic decisions concentrated users, investments, and attention on private platforms, creating network effects that make it almost impossible to abandon them individually or collectively. Network effects turn these platforms into something very different from a regular company. Their value does not primarily lie in the technology they use, but in the human network they concentrate. A social network is valuable because it is where the people we communicate with are. A digital service is valuable because it is where relevant activity takes place. Leaving it means losing access to that network, not simply switching providers. The value is in the network, but the network has been captured by private owners. Migrating it would require massive collective coordination, which the platforms themselves make almost impossible by fragmenting and isolating users. This structure resembles feudalism much more than classical capitalism. Feudal lords did not dominate because they owned superior tools, but because they controlled the land, which was essential for survival. Peasants had knowledge and tools, but lacked autonomous access to the resource that made their life possible. They were not bound by labor contracts, but by structural dependency. The land was not an open market. It was controlled infrastructure. The owners of cloud capital today occupy an analogous position. They do not employ us directly, but they control infrastructures without which it is increasingly difficult to communicate, work, sell, inform oneself, or participate in social life. The companies that operate on these platforms do not compete in open markets, but pay tribute for access to an infrastructure that does not belong to them. They accept unilateral conditions, arbitrary changes, and constant surveillance that would be unthinkable in classical commercial relationships. The key difference from historical feudalism is that this dependency is presented as voluntary. No one legally forces us to use these platforms. We can leave them just as a peasant could leave the lord's land. But in both cases, formal freedom coexists with such deep material dependence that leaving means exclusion, impoverishment, or social isolation. Coercion does not need to be imposed when it is embedded in the very structure of everyday life. The paradox is that many of us genuinely enjoy these services. They connect us, entertain us, make tasks easier, save us time. We do not feel oppressed. On the contrary, we often experience these technologies as tools of autonomy and empowerment. This experience is real and should not be dismissed. The system works precisely because it offers authentic benefits, but this utility does not eliminate the structure of domination that operates beneath the surface. The algorithms do not need to be malicious, nor their designers cynical conspirators. It is enough for them to be optimized to maximize attention, retention, and data extraction. It is enough for companies to seek to increase their value. It is enough for us to seek convenience. Domination does not arise from evil intent, but from the sum of rational behaviors within a structure that turns these individual decisions into a collective, deeply asymmetric result. This systemic nature makes cloud capital especially hard to resist. There is no visible enemy to rebel against. There is no single act of coercion to denounce. Integration happens gradually through thousands of small choices that seem reasonable on their own. When dependency becomes evident, it is already so deeply rooted that escaping it requires sacrifices most cannot afford. Moreover, this capital is not limited to the spaces it has already colonized. It continuously expands into new spheres of life. Connected cars turn travel into data. Smart homes transform domestic life into actionable information. The digitization of health turns our bodies into sources of economic value. Every area that connects becomes a new enclosed territory, a new source of dependency, a new form of unpaid labor. What is at stake is not just a matter of income, employment, or wealth distribution, though all of that is important. What is at stake is human autonomy. Freedom does not only consist in no one directly forcing us to do something. It requires the existence of real alternatives and the effective ability to choose between them. When all options pass through private infrastructures that we do not control, freedom becomes emptied of content, even if it is still proclaimed in the abstract. Cloud capital has achieved something that industrial capital never fully managed. It has integrated the entire social life into circuits of private accumulation without the need for explicit contracts or visible coercion. It has done so by building dependencies that are experienced as convenience, transforming voluntary participation into a mechanism of permanent extraction. Work is disguised as leisure. Surveillance is presented as personalization. Dependence is experienced as service. This system cannot be corrected through market competition because it has eliminated the conditions that make competition possible. It also cannot be effectively regulated from traditional nation-states, because it operates on a global scale through infrastructures that cross borders and jurisdictions. And it cannot be rejected individually, because the dependency is collective and structural. We are faced with a form of domination without clear precedents. It is not imposed by force. It is not legitimized through explicit ideologies, and it is not perceived as oppression. It works precisely because it is confused with freedom. When every action passes through private infrastructures, when every identity exists fragmented in records we do not control, freedom ceases to be a real practice. The New Lords: Power Without Market. August 12, 2020. London wakes up to a devastating piece of news. The British economy has just suffered the greatest contraction in its entire history. National income has plummeted by more than 20% in just a few months, a figure that is unprecedented in peacetime. For generations, such a figure would have meant one very specific thing: panic. Sudden stock market crashes, desperate sales, investors fleeing to save whatever they could. For more than 2 centuries, capitalism had operated with a basic and almost automatic rule. Bad economic news meant bad news for financial markets. However, this time something happens that completely breaks that logic. Just 15 minutes after the official announcement, the London Stock Exchange does not collapse. It does exactly the opposite. It rises more than 2% in a matter of minutes. There is no confusion or doubt among the traders. They have reached a conclusion that completely reverses the traditional meaning of capitalism. If the news is bad enough, the Bank of England will panic. And when central banks panic, they always react in the same way. They create money and inject it massively into the financial system. When markets know that money is coming, they buy stocks without hesitation. In this new world, economic catastrophes no longer signal losses but guaranteed liquidity. Missing that opportunity would simply be foolish. This moment symbolically marks the beginning of a new era, not because technology changed that day, nor because a revolutionary invention emerged, but because something much deeper was revealed. Capitalism had stopped functioning according to its own fundamental rules. For 250 years, the engine of the system had been corporate profit. Companies invested, produced, sold, and made profits that, in turn, financed new investments. now that fuel had been replaced by something very different, the permanent intervention of central banks. And in a world where money flows from public institutions into financial markets, those who can best take advantage of it are not traditional capitalists, but a new class of power, the lords of cloud capital. To understand how we got here, it is necessary to go back to 2008, to the moment when the Western financial system collapsed after decades of unchecked speculation. Governments were then faced with an extreme decision. They could either let the banks fall and risk a repeat of the Great Depression, or they could bail them out using public money. They chose the bailout. The Federal Reserve bought toxic assets on a large scale. The European Central Bank flooded the system with long-term loans. The Bank of England lowered interest rates to unprecedented levels. But these measures not only saved financial institutions, they also saved those who had caused the disaster and allowed their practices to continue almost unchanged. At the same time, a brutal austerity policy was imposed on workers and the middle classes. This combination proved devastating for the normal functioning of capitalism. Austerity destroyed demand just when the economy needed it most. When public spending is reduced during a recession, when wages fall and employment becomes precarious, the demand for goods and services collapses. And when companies see that no one can buy what they produce, they don't invest, no matter how cheap credit is. It makes no sense to build new factories if there are no customers who can afford the products that will come out of them. The economy comes to a standstill not because of a lack of money, but because of a lack of buyers. Thus, austerity ended up killing productive investment. And once investment was dead, the trillions that central banks began injecting into the financial system had no clear destination. Between 2009 and 2014, the Federal Reserve purchased more than $3 trillion in bonds and financial assets. The European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan followed similar paths. Large companies could borrow almost for free, but they still refused to invest. They saw a society in poverty, stagnant wages, and a future without real consumption growth. There was no market for high-value products, so that money wasn't used to produce more, but to artificially inflate stock prices through massive buybacks. Real investment disappeared while financial wealth grew enormously. This created a profoundly strange situation. Money continued to function as a medium of exchange, and inflation remained low. But its price, the interest rate, fell to zero and even below. By 2016, several of the world's leading central banks were operating with negative interest rates. This means something that for centuries would have seemed absurd. Lenders paid borrowers to take out loans. Money had transformed into a sort of uncomfortable residue that was costly to store, something that had to be placed somewhere at any price. This behavior of money revealed a deeper truth about its nature. Money is not just another commodity whose price falls when there's too much. It is also an expression of our collective ability to organize work and transform the world. When interest rates become negative, they not only indicate an abundance of money, they indicate that this collective ability has been broken. Money flows in gigantic amounts, but it does not find its way into serious investments, stable jobs, or projects capable of reactivating the basic drive of capitalism. It is in this scenario where the lords of cloud capital emerge. For years, some of the most influential companies in the world barely generated profits, or didn't generate any at all. Amazon operated for a long time with minimal margins while relentlessly expanding its infrastructure. Tesla reached gigantic valuations long before showing sustained profits. Facebook offered free services financed by advertising, whose profitability took years to consolidate. In normal capitalism, such companies would have gone bankrupt or been absorbed by more profitable competitors. But after 2008, the rules stopped being normal. The ocean of liquidity created by central banks allowed unprofitable companies to survive indefinitely, while their stock market valuations multiplied. Investors understood that in a world flooded with cheap money, what mattered was no longer making money today, but dominating markets tomorrow. Controlling essential digital infrastructure became more valuable than any positive balance sheet. The promise of unlimited future income replaced present profit. Here, a key distinction appears to understand this new system: the difference between profit and rent. Profit comes from producing goods or services and selling them in competitive markets. It forces innovation, cost reduction, and convincing consumers who can always choose another option. Rent, on the other hand, does not depend on competition, but on controlling something others depend on. Whoever controls that resource can charge simply for granting access. There's no need to improve or convince. It's enough to maintain control. The lords of cloud capital have applied this logic to the digital space. They don't need immediate profits while building platforms that millions of people and businesses depend on to work, sell, communicate, or simply exist in the digital world. Once that control is secured, rent extraction becomes automatic. The market stops being a space of competition and turns into a system of structural dependence, where formal freedom coexists with a silent but constant coercion. Once control is consolidated, rent extraction becomes almost invisible. Let's think about the small seller who operates through a large digital platform. On paper, they run an independent business and freely choose to use that service. In practice, that freedom is purely formal. The platform controls such a large volume of buyers that selling outside of it is tantamount to disappearing. Consumers no longer search for products in the open space of the internet, but within a single closed ecosystem that decides what is seen, what is recommended, and what remains hidden. That seller pays increasingly high commissions for every transaction. They accept conditions that the platform unilaterally changes, with no possible negotiation. They also compete against products sold by the platform itself, which uses the aggregated data from thousands of sellers to identify what works and launch its own versions, preferentially promoted. The seller knows that complaining is pointless. They also know that any attempt at resistance could end with their expulsion from the system on which their economic survival depends. It's not a relationship between equal parties. It's a structural dependence. The seller can leave, just as a serf could leave their lord's land. But doing so means losing access to the means that allow them to make a living. Freedom exists on the legal plane, but coercion operates on the material plane. The market, in its classical sense, no longer exists. Consumers live a very similar experience. They use these platforms as if they were free choices that simplify daily life. And in many ways they do. Shopping is faster, communication is easier, finding information seems immediate. But at the same time, every action is recorded. Every search, every click, every conversation, every scroll, every expressed preference becomes data. This surveillance is not a byproduct. It's the core of the system. The data is not primarily collected to improve services, though that is the visible justification. They constitute the raw material of cloud capital. Algorithms process this information to learn how to predict behaviors and, increasingly, how to shape them. The user feeds the algorithm with their actions. The algorithm rearranges the user's digital environment to guide their future decisions. This creates a constant feedback loop that converges towards patterns increasingly favorable to the interests of the platform owner. This process can be clearly seen in the operation of TikTok. The app organizes content from a homepage that does not rely on searches or conscious user choices, but on a continuous flow of videos automatically selected. The system records very specific signals: how long each video is watched, whether it is repeated, whether it is skipped quickly, whether the sound is turned on, or if there is any interaction with the screen. With this information, the algorithm adjusts in real time the sequence of videos that appears next. With continued use, the user stops actively choosing what they want to see and begins consuming a chain of content designed to prolong their time on the app. What's decisive is that this system reproduces itself thanks to a form of massive labor that receives neither salary nor recognition. Every social media post, every photo uploaded, every comment, every review, every search, every recorded movement is work that increases the value of cloud capital. However, this labor is not paid, not accounted for, and not even perceived as such. Billions of people work daily without knowing they are, convinced that they are simply using free services. The difference with traditional companies is vast. In the industrial economy, wages represent the largest portion of costs. In cloud capital, wages are a minimal fraction of income, not because these companies are miraculously efficient, but because the bulk of the work is performed by users who don't appear on any payroll. The system turns everyday life into a continuous source of economic value, while presenting that extraction as entertainment, convenience, or social connection. This structure has allowed for an accumulation of wealth without historical precedent. In just a decade, the wealth of the main owners of cloud capital multiplied exponentially. That enrichment wasn't the result of extraordinary profits obtained from selling products, but from stock market valuations inflated by a financial system saturated with liquidity created by central banks. Money was desperately seeking a place to go, and it found it in these dominant platforms. With those inflated valuations as collateral, the lords of cloud capital accessed enormous loans that they used to expand their power even further. They bought potential competitors before they became a threat. They expanded into neighboring sectors, blocking any future alternatives. They invested in technologies such as artificial intelligence, robotics, and advanced computing, not only to innovate, but to reinforce their structural control over markets and entire societies. Meanwhile, large industrial corporations began to deteriorate. Iconic companies lost value, entire sectors became obsolete, and traditional commerce emptied out as digital platforms absorbed market share. Even banks, historical pillars of capitalism, discovered that tech companies could offer financial services with impossible-to-match advantages, thanks to data control and their direct relationship with users. But the change was deeper than a mere replacement of old companies with new ones. Profit ceased to be the central driving force of the system. For more than 2 centuries, the dominant economic theory had held that the pursuit of profit drove innovation and social progress. To make money, companies had to compete, improve products, and lower prices. This logic connected private interests with a certain collective benefit. After 2008, that mechanism broke down. Profit continued to exist as an individual goal, but it was no longer necessary to accumulate capital. Central banks took its place as the primary source of financing. In this new environment, those who thrived were not the ones who produced better, but those who achieved greater capacity to extract rents by controlling essential infrastructure. Power replaced competition as the criterion for success. This logic also spread to other areas of financial capitalism. Large investment firms stopped focusing on improving profitable companies and began extracting value directly from assets. Through complex legal structures, they separated operational companies from the assets they needed to function, burdening them with inflated rents and indebting them to the point of collapse. The goal was no longer to build long-term value, but to extract it quickly while asset prices continued to rise thanks to constant liquidity. None of this would have been possible without a financial system perpetually fueled by cheap money. Under normal conditions, the massive liquidation of assets would have caused their prices to fall. But with central banks willing to intervene time and again, prices rose regardless of economic reality. The extraction could be repeated indefinitely. Thus, the historical relationship was completely reversed. For centuries, rent had been a residual form compared to profit. After the financial crisis, rent became the dominant principle. Capitalism was no longer organized around competitive markets, but around structures of dependency that allowed charging simply for access to economic and social life. This change found its institutional expression in asset management giants that concentrated holdings in nearly every major company. By offering passive investment that bought up the entire market, they absorbed the surplus wealth of an economy with no productive destination. The result was a silent concentration of power without the need for conspiracies or explicit political decisions. The final picture is clear. Central banks, created to stabilize capitalism, radically transformed it. Liquidity replaced profit. Rent displaced competition. Cloud capital turned users and workers into components of algorithmic systems that operate beyond the effective control of markets and governments. The new lords have achieved something unprecedented. They have freed themselves from market discipline without openly taking political power. They have built a system of domination that doesn't need to justify itself ideologically, because it is experienced as convenience and efficiency. When communication requires private platforms, when information means handing over data, when shopping goes through infrastructures that extract commissions, when working means obeying algorithms, and when participating socially demands constant surveillance, choice remains only in appearance. Freedom remains in discourse, while coercion settles into the very structure of daily life. A world divided by infrastructure. For centuries, the history of imperial power was told as a succession of territorial dominions. Empires conquered lands, subdued populations, extracted tributes, and over time collapsed under the weight of their own tensions or the pressure of new rivals. The Roman Empire, the Tang dynasty, the Ottoman Empire, or the British Empire followed that basic pattern, with differences in context, but a common logic. Power was exercised by controlling physical territories and those who inhabited them. The American empire that emerged after World War II seemed, at first, to continue that tradition. It established military bases on every continent, built regional alliances, supported friendly governments, and overthrew hostile ones. However, alongside this visible dimension, it developed a form of domination that was much less evident and far more enduring. Instead of relying solely on military occupation, it articulated its power around a global financial infrastructure. The international monetary system centered on the dollar. The turning point came in 1971 when the United States decided to unlink the dollar from gold. With that move, it achieved something unprecedented in history. From then on, it could finance increasingly larger trade deficits by issuing a currency that the rest of the world needed to trade. The traditional imperial logic was completely reversed. Instead of extracting direct tributes, the United States offered access to its market in exchange for the profits being reinvested in the form of financial investments, public debt, or real estate and stock market assets within its own territory. This mechanism generated very powerful incentives. Exporting countries such as China, Japan, and Germany accumulated enormous surpluses by selling to American consumers. However, these surpluses were denominated in dollars and could not be reinvested productively in their own economies without triggering a revaluation of their currencies, which would ruin their export competitiveness. The only viable option was to return those dollars to the United States, channeling them into treasury bonds, Wall Street, and the real estate markets of major financial cities. Thus, a silent pact was consolidated between the American economic elite and the ruling classes of Asia and Europe. The United States would guarantee constant demand financed through debt. In exchange, foreign capital would return to the American financial heart, supporting both the hegemony of the dollar and the profitability of the financial sector concentrated in New York. The system seemed stable, but its functioning rested on sacrifices distributed in an extremely unequal manner. American workers were the ones who paid a central part of that cost. As industrial production shifted to countries with much lower wages, millions of manufacturing jobs disappeared. Entire regions, once prosperous industrial hubs, turned into landscapes of abandoned factories, structural unemployment, and communities worn down by decades of stagnant wages and social decay. At the other end of the global production chains, Chinese workers endured equally harsh conditions. Coastal cities transformed into massive manufacturing centers where working hours were grueling, wages barely sufficient, and labor protections almost non-existent. While income increased in statistical terms, that growth came at the cost of deep alienation, the uprooting of millions of people, and an environmental degradation of enormous magnitude. For the poorest countries, the situation was even more severe. Without privileged access to the US market, they had to borrow in dollars to import basic energy, food, and technology. This debt trapped them in a permanent cycle of adjustments, privatizations, and social cuts. International organizations acted as enforcers of this order, imposing conditions that transferred control of essential infrastructures into private and foreign hands, further weakening the economic sovereignty of these states. For decades, this system maintained US hegemony while enriching elites scattered across the globe, but its fragility was exposed with the 2008 financial crisis. In the face of collapse, the United States bailed out the financial system with enormous amounts of money while imposing discipline and sacrifices on the majority of the population. China, however, responded very differently, driving a massive expansion of domestic investment that sustained global demand as Western economies contracted. Europe, on the other hand, chose severe austerity that deeply harmed several of its economies. These unequal responses altered the global balance. China emerged as a power capable of stabilizing the system when the West withdrew. Starting in 2013, it began deploying a strategy of expansion based on infrastructure, financing ports, railways, and power plants in dozens of countries. Entire regions became connected to Chinese capital and trade flows, forming a network of influence that no longer depended solely on the US market. A decisive element of this strategy was the support for the development of its own digital platforms. While the United States saw the rise of large tech companies, China pushed for the development of its own digital ecosystems, which not only replicated these models, but integrated them much more deeply. Commerce, communication, payments, and financial services were unified into platforms that organized the everyday economic life of hundreds of millions of people. This integration provided structural advantages that were difficult to match. Instead of using multiple fragmented applications, users could carry out almost all their economic activities within the same digital environment. What seemed like a technical detail hid much deeper implications. These platforms didn't just facilitate transactions. They constituted complete infrastructures capable of operating relatively autonomously from the traditional financial system dominated by the United States. For a time, this divergence didn't threaten the established order. Economies remained deeply interconnected, and financial flows continued recycling surpluses back to the center of the system. However, that balance began to crack when economic power shifted from being primarily dependent on industry to concentrating on the control of digital infrastructures capable of extracting rents directly on a global scale. The first element that definitively broke the balance was the avalanche of liquidity created by central banks after 2008. That money wasn't directed at rebuilding the productive economy, but at financing the explosive expansion of cloud capital. Large platforms began displacing industrial capital as the main source of economic power. This change altered fundamental strategic calculations. Unlike traditional industry, cloud capital could extract rents directly from foreign markets without requiring those countries to maintain recyclable trade surpluses towards the United States. An application could generate billions in global advertising without exporting a single physical good or relying on the old dollar circuit. The second decisive factor was the development of an alternative monetary infrastructure. In 2020, China launched the digital yuan on an experimental basis, the first digital currency issued directly by a central bank. For the first time, it became possible to conduct international transactions without going through Western private banks or the financial clearing systems controlled by the United States. Money could circulate directly between users and businesses, reducing the dependence on the financial infrastructure that had sustained US hegemony for decades. For a time, these innovations didn't seem to disrupt the global order. The dollar remained the reference by custom, accumulated trust, and the lack of fully deployed alternatives. But everything changed in 2022 when the United States decided to freeze the Russian central bank's reserves following the invasion of Ukraine. That measure exposed something many preferred not to see. The global financial infrastructure could be used as a geopolitical weapon, even against sovereign states. The message was unequivocal and resonated with economic elites worldwide. From that moment on, the search for alternatives ceased to be a technical issue and became an existential necessity. If a country's reserves could be frozen overnight, no asset denominated in dollars was truly safe. Alternative payment systems and sovereign digital currencies began to be seen as potential refugees from a financial power capable of punishing without resorting to war. Almost simultaneously, the United States intensified its technological offensive. Severe restrictions were imposed on the export of advanced semiconductors and the machinery needed to produce them, not only to US companies but also to those in allied countries. The stated goal was to halt China's technological development in key areas such as artificial intelligence. In practice, it was about preventing Chinese cloud capital from achieving autonomy that would allow it to escape the structural dependence on the dollar-dominated system. China's response was consistent with that reading. If access to Western technology was going to be closed off, the only option was to accelerate the construction of its own infrastructure. Massive investments in internal technological development were increased, national digital ecosystems were reinforced, and the use of Chinese payment systems and digital currencies in international trade was actively promoted. The world thus began to fragment into two large spheres of influence, not defined by physical borders, but by digital infrastructures. This fragmentation does not manifest as a clean and orderly division. A single country, company, or even person can simultaneously operate within both ecosystems. But this coexistence becomes increasingly difficult as both powers demand exclusive loyalties. The United States pressures its allies to limit the use of Chinese technologies. China, in turn, conditions investments and financing on the adoption of its own infrastructures. Ambiguity is no longer tolerable, and the pressure to choose sides intensifies. Europe embodies this paralysis most clearly. It is economically dependent on trade with China, technologically reliant on US platforms, financially tied to the dollar system, and militarily protected by the United States. This multiple dependence reduces its room for maneuver to nearly zero. Every decision means going against one of the poles of power. Unable to build its own digital infrastructures at a sufficient scale, Europe swings between both empires without becoming an autonomous force. For the global South, the options are even tougher. Many countries desperately need investments in energy, transportation, and communications. China offers fast financing without demanding explicit political reforms, but it creates technological dependence and debt. The West offers alternatives conditioned on austerity and privatization programs. In both cases, sovereignty is compromised. Trying to balance between the two blocs works only temporarily, until the pressures become incompatible. This division doesn't only affect the economy. Digital platforms organize communication, information, and social life. Choosing a technological ecosystem means accepting which actors control the data, which algorithms determine what is seen, and which authorities can access that information. The US model relies on massive corporate surveillance, formally private but accessible to the state. The Chinese model explicitly integrates platforms into state control systems. Both differ in their discourse, but they share a logic of constant supervision. For individuals living within these systems, the choice is not between freedom and control, but between different forms of subjugation. Daily life occurs through infrastructures that cannot be abandoned without being excluded from economic and social life. Surveillance stops being an exception and becomes the normal condition for participation. The digital rivalry also intensifies the struggle for essential physical resources. Digital infrastructures depend on critical materials, concentrated supply chains, and strategic territories. Control of these elements becomes as important as the control of data and algorithms. Latent conflicts thus overlap with technological competition, increasing the risk of broader confrontations. Beyond the risk of open war, this fragmentation weakens the capacity for global cooperation. Problems like climate change, pandemics, or financial crises require coordination between major powers, but structural distrust turns every initiative into a battleground of competition. Even efforts aimed at protecting the planet or public health get caught in the logic of rival blocs. In this context, democracy faces a profound challenge. The decisions that shape daily life are no longer made in spaces subject to democratic control, but in infrastructures managed by corporations or foreign states. Elected governments find that they can no longer effectively regulate what their own societies depend on. Formal sovereignty persists, but real power shifts to systems that operate beyond the reach of traditional politics. We are not witnessing a mere adjustment of the international order. We are witnessing the formation of a world divided into digital fiefdoms, where the control of infrastructures replaces the control of territories. Two great empires concentrate unprecedented power, while the rest of humanity is trapped between them, forced to adapt to systems they did not choose. When social, economic, and political life entirely depends on private and opaque infrastructures, the question of freedom stops being abstract. It is no longer about choosing between options within a system, but about questioning whether the conditions that make a real choice possible still exist. That exact point is where the contemporary world finds itself now.